Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Today we are continuing the breakdown of the introduction on the APA guidelines for women and girls. As I mentioned in the previous video, there's still a surprising lot to get through in here, so let's go ahead. While this brief introduction cannot do justice to all the research on girls and women and their intersecting identities to which these practice guidelines should be responsive, there are several groups that deserve special attention given continued invisibility in the literature and/or a current focus based on need. Gender nonconforming identities, older women, female veterans, and girls and women with disabilities. We refer readers to an accompanying monograph for research on other identities and on particular disorders not adequately described in this introduction. I know they're going to get into this in more detail going forward, but I just want to remark once again on the challenge of breaking down counseling strategies into identity pieces like this. I know the perspective they're coming from. By being aware of all the ways intersecting personality factors contribute to one's experiences, you have the potential to be more effective with them. The problem with this is, when we place our focus on all the potential specific things that might contribute to someone's experiences, we not only run the risk of making assumptions about the experiences of our clients, but your assumptions might then take away from being truly effective with the things they are actually wanting to talk about. For example, if you are assuming that someone is depressed because of minority stress, yes, that is literally a term they use coming up here, but in reality, they are just depressed because they're struggling with isolation, you run the risk of taking the wrong course in therapy. This can also be further compounded. Maybe you might assume they might be struggling to make connections with others because of something to do with their identity. This might affect how you explore the topic with the client, rather than taking, say, a more generalized approach, such as exploring communication patterns or addressing self-confidence issues. Am I saying that it's completely worthless to be aware of how identity pieces might contribute to one's experiences? No, but I am saying it's probably not something that should be the therapist's focus unless the client directly brings it up. Currently, there is a dearth of research examining transgender women regarding mental illness or maladjustment. However, as noted by the American Psychological Association, the etiology of mental health problems may or may not be linked directly to a person's gender identity, but to pervasive experiences of minority stress. Transgender and gender nonconforming individuals are at increased risk for suicide attempts, i.e. 41% as compared to 1.6% in the general population, in part because of bias-related experiences such as sexual and physical victimization. Transgender women and feminine of center individuals who were assigned male at birth are impacted by heavily gendered societal pressures. Oh, we're going to break down specific women's identities? I know exactly where to begin. All jokes aside, as ever, this is always the subject I hate talking about most because everyone seems to have forgotten how to have a rational, balanced conversation about it without pointing their fingers and screaming bigot or transphobe. I think we should simultaneously be able to acknowledge three things. 1. Transgender individuals are human beings like everyone else who deserve basic human respect and consideration. 2. Honestly acknowledging the very real differences between transgender women and women should not be seen as bigoted, but rather respectful and aware of the very different experiences that both groups face. And finally, 3. The focus on transgender issues when talking about issues that impact women and men. I felt the same in the APA guidelines on men and boys whenever this subject arose. Often feels out of place and pandery given the differences in experiences that these groups face. Quite frankly, I feel like it would be far more respectful to everyone involved if we had a separate guideline for working with transgender individuals. It's win-win. We can be more precise in that we are talking about relevant groups with relevant guidelines, And transgender individuals don't have to feel like they are shoehorned in after the fact with guidelines that may not fully represent their experiences anyway. Also, this is just an aside, but feminine of center individuals? Really? Psychologists and members of the public tend not to be aware of the psychological benefits of aging for women in the US, including feeling freer of gender role stereotypes and gendered roles. However, there are psychological issues for older women that practitioners need to be aware of, including problems with financial resources, abuse, racial and ethnic bias, and bias against those with specific disabilities associated with aging. Compared to older men, they are more likely to be living in poverty, suffer from disabilities, and experience elder abuse and neglect. Women account for 70% of all older adults with incomes below the poverty level. Older women can be especially at risk for depression, alcohol problems, and loneliness. In addition, ageism persists. Women of all ages face powerful negative stereotypes of who they will become as they grow old. Older women are seen, even by psychologists, as less competitive, less competent, less assertive, and less willing to take risks than younger women. There is just so much in this paragraph that made me raise an eyebrow that I figured we would go ahead and cover the whole thing. First of all, you can really hear the bias in the first sentence. There's this subtle implication that gender roles, or even gender role stereotypes for that matter, are necessarily something that one would want to be free from. Sure, you have plenty of women who will jokingly embrace their bog witch years and let loose any expectations of the world around them. But there are women out there who rather appreciate the benefits afforded them because of those gender roles. How often have you seen articles from older ladies lamenting the lack of male attention, even catcalling, as a result of getting older? There are plenty of women who may take this as a loss of an element of their identity, and being flippant about that may run the risk of offending some. Second, they talk quite a lot about the negative things that women may be more likely to face in their older years, but I must admit, I wonder how much of this may be because women are likely to live 5 to 6 years longer than men on average. It's hard not to be the ones more likely to have negative things happening in one's golden years when they are the ones getting so many more golden years. I recall my own grandmother beginning to struggle with finances toward the end of her life, but the fact of the matter is that she had about a decade longer than my grandfather, so naturally this was a problem that impacted her but not him. It also makes sense that older women would be more likely to be lonely given their likelihood to outlive their spouses. I say all this because I think it is far more important to know why these are problems more likely to impact women, because it helps to direct the therapy towards how these problems can be addressed. Lastly, the final sentence just strikes me as a little bit odd. I mean, are older ladies, or older men for that example, well known for being competitive risk takers who are equally as competent as their younger counterparts? It's not really something I would walk into a counseling room assuming about anyone, but if I had to guess a lot of the time, sorry to say it, but the older an individual is, the more likely I think anyone would think these traits tend to decrease. There are a lot of unfortunate physiological processes that occur with age that would naturally seem to decrease a lot of these traits. However, I would hope that a competent therapist wouldn't go into a session with an elderly woman immediately doubting or dismissing their abilities. What have I always said about making assumptions as a therapist? Female military veterans are a group of women particularly at risk. The nature of military service, coupled with high rates of violence and trauma experienced throughout the female veteran's life, can lead to a number of challenges. Nearly 90% of female veterans have endorsed at least one traumatic event in their life, a rate higher than their male counterparts as well as the general population, and approximately 40% experience military sexual trauma. Female veterans reported the highest rates of lifetime and past-year post-traumatic stress disorder compared with female civilians, male veterans, and male civilians, and military trauma contributes to the likelihood of developing PTSD. Okay, I will fully admit I know very little of military experiences. It is absolutely not something I have a lot of experience with talking with people about, nor any personal or familial involvement to that end. My general default, where I have no such experience, is usually to stay mum about the issue and leave it to someone else to talk about. However, I will simply remark my surprise in the data listed here, as it was always my understanding that, even to this day, women are generally not as involved in active combat duty as their male counterparts. I mean, I suppose it's possible that the high rates of PTSD in female veterans could be augmented by the amount of sexual trauma they face, but unless I am wildly outdated in my data or their participation in combat roles, well, I will just reiterate my surprise. The World Health Organization estimates more than 1 billion people worldwide live with some form of disability. According to the WHO report, there are 200 million individuals who have difficulty functioning. Girls and women with disabilities still tend to be underrepresented in our understanding of psychological practice. Children from under-resourced communities are more likely to be disabled and excluded from education around the world. Girls and women with disabilities are at greater risk of being abused in the US and internationally. Women with disabilities are less likely than temporarily abled women to receive a college education. Temporarily abled? That's certainly a new one. Never heard that one before. Sounds kinda ominous if you ask me. You are abled for now. The only other comment I have here is just that it's striking how often women seem to be underrepresented, considering how often I see this complaint come up. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying I see it come up an awful lot. And I don't really see any corresponding commentary when women are overrepresented in the literature or in any fields of experience. These contexts, experiences, and identities form an important backdrop for psychologists to consider when treating girls and women. They also contribute to vulnerabilities regarding the development of diagnoses and maladaptive coping responses. For example, women who experience interpersonal violence are more likely to be diagnosed with psychosis. Substance use and abuse among women and girls continues to rise, as well as deaths from drug use among women. There has been an increase for women with respect to rates of incarceration, independent of male incarcerations. Girls in the juvenile justice system have increased levels of mental health issues. This feels like another toss whatever at the wall and see what sticks paragraph. Within this same paragraph, they go on to talk about the pipeline to prison for marginalized individuals, the harms of sexual abuse, and the risk of body image and eating disorders. I don't know if whoever wrote this introduction knows this, but it doesn't make things sound more complete when you just try to wedge as much scattershot information into one section as possible. It makes the document feel random and disorganized. In terms of psychological vulnerabilities, researchers have continued to find that women are significantly more likely to experience depression, are more vulnerable to depression relapse, and endure longer depressive episodes than men. Girls also experience depression at a greater frequency than boys, with girls who reach puberty earlier particularly vulnerable. Women who are subjected to individual and group discrimination are even more likely to experience depression. Girls and women are also 10 times more likely to have eating disorders than boys and men. In addition, women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with nearly every anxiety disorder, including panic disorder, agoraphobia, and PTSD, compared to men. I have talked about this many times on my channel, as many textbooks have portrayed this discrepancy as a result of the patriarchy and external pressures on women, whereas simple research demonstrates the effect of female hormones on mood lability. The problem is, when we try to propose this as being a major component of women's experiences, you see a frankly wild amount of defensiveness and projection about it. I don't understand why we can't just have a frank and honest discussion about how hormones impact both women and men, because I think if we could approach the subject with maturity rather than dismissiveness, we could have better, more effective ways of handling it. For example, tools and coping mechanisms around different times of women's monthly cycles, or the dramatic changes many women experience around menopause. Moreover, girls and women tend to bear the brunt of problematic diagnoses. Specific diagnoses that have been analyzed in terms of overdiagnosis among girls and women as a result of gender bias include histrionic and borderline personality disorders, depression, dissociative disorders, somatization disorder, and agoraphobia. Disorders diagnosed in childhood and adolescence, in particular attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder, as well as PTSD and antisocial personality disorder, are examples of potentially underdiagnosed disorders resulting from gender bias, such as failing to account for possible differences in presentation across genders. See, this paragraph is a good example of what I'm talking about. Problematic diagnoses. If the behaviors that lead many physicians and psychologists to believe women have these diagnoses are so common, maybe we should ask why that is instead of automatically jumping to assume the diagnoses are problematic. For example, we know the categories of behaviors that fall into things like BPD or other personality disorders. If these traits are more common in women than men, why is that? What are the contributing factors? Maybe if we examine this without getting defensive and dismissive about it, we can find more concrete ways of addressing matters, either directly addressing the symptoms or even addressing root causes of symptoms, from the individual down to the cultural. Now, on the other hand, I will grant that there are many professionals out there who will just dismiss every concern, slap a label on it, prescribe pills, and push people out the door. But I do not think this is a problem that exclusively affects women. This is how people get diagnosed with IBS when in reality they're in the early stages of cancer. In many ways, I feel like we should be much more thorough and measured before handing out any diagnostic labels to people, as I have seen how they can be misused. Overall, I think there needs to be more oversight and careful analysis in general to ensure the correct diagnoses are being handed down. Yes, even the problematic ones. Girls and women draw on a considerable array of strengths and resilience to cope with these and other gender-based adversities. Throughout their lifespans, girls and women demonstrate marked resilience. Women live longer than men, and as they get older, are less likely to be impacted by isolation. Wait, less likely? Didn't they say before that elderly women are more likely to experience loneliness? Are they lonely but surrounded by other people or something? While women are more likely to experience poverty, their relationships and strengths can mean they are less harmed by its effects compared to men. Girls enjoy more supportive friendships characterized by equality, self-disclosure, and empathy. Women are generally more sexually fluid over the lifespan, which may allow greater opportunities for more varied loving and/or sexual relationships. See, here is another example of how assuming can go weird on us. Just because we want to present bisexuality in a positive light, it doesn't mean that it will always be experienced that way by our clients. I have talked to many people, hell, I have been one of those people, for whom it was a confusing and upsetting experience, especially in the face of judgments from those around them. If I had talked to a therapist about my feelings for both men and women in my youth, and they had bubbled over with positivity about it, first of all, it would have been deeply embarrassing, and second of all, it would have felt dismissive and detached from my real-world experiences, which involved a fair amount of stigma and negativity at the time. It feels odd to come at one of their examples from the other direction for a change, that is, being critical of being too positive rather than too negative or fear-mongery, but I hope it shows that I'm trying to be consistent here. Assumptions about our clients are bad, whether we assume in the negative or assume in the positive. The majority of those seeking mental health services continue to be female, and given the experiences and context described and the diversity of backgrounds, may have unique treatment needs, particularly in areas of growing concern such as substance abuse and stress disorders. The new guidelines for the practice of girls and women aims at including a broad range of girls and women in the US and globally. See, that's the neat part. Everyone has unique treatment needs. Isn't it funny how that works? Purpose and scope. The purpose of these guidelines is to assist psychologists in the provision of gender-sensitive, culturally competent, and developmentally appropriate psychological practice with girls and women across the lifespan from all social classes, ethnic and racial groups, sexual orientations, abilities and disabilities, and other diversity statuses in the US and globally. These guidelines provide general recommendations for psychologists who seek to increase their awareness, knowledge, and skills in psychological practice with girls and women. The guidelines address the strengths of girls and women, their intersectional identities. See Appendix A for a definition of intersectional and other important terms, as well as an explanation for the use of the word fat. Okay, hold up. Fat is used as a descriptor of one's physical size. Heating scholars such as Lee and Pauzet and McHugh and Casardo, the term fat is used rather than those that suggest pathology such as overweight, which implies that there is a correct weight, and obese, which denotes a medical condition. We recognize that fat has been used as an insult and pejorative word, a form of oppression in itself. But language evolves, and current thinkers argue that words such as overweight and obese carry with them their own medicalizing and marginalizing effects. These scholars have advocated for a reclaiming of the word fat, much like the word queer was reclaimed to free women and girls from body shame. I don't get why this is so difficult for people. There may not be an exact correct weight, but that has never been what anyone has been saying. What has been said is that there is a weight range based partially on one's height and on a ratio of muscle to fat, where we see ideal health outcomes for the largest majority of individuals, and outside that range, most commonly over, but also under, there is an increased likelihood, not a certainty, of certain health problems. There's such an embarrassing amount of teeth gnashing around this subject when it really is that simple. Certainly, it is rude and inconsiderate to attack or insult people for their size, but trying to act as though having too much fat is not a risk to one's health in the face of overwhelming evidence is like plugging one's ears and screaming, "La la 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 la, I can't hear you." It's embarrassing, and I would argue inappropriate in a document like this. At any rate, the rest of the introduction is just a few brief sections talking about documentation of need, distinctions between standards and guidelines, and a section on compatibility where they talk about the fact that much of what is contained within this document can be more widely applicable than to just women and girls. They also mention that they actually do have a guideline for practice with transgender individuals, so hey, I stand partially corrected on my earlier comment. It does then beg the question as to why the additions in this and the guidelines for men and boys, but whatever. Anyway, that's that. The massive introduction to the APA guideline on women and girls. I have a feeling this is going to be a very different ride than what we saw with the guideline on men and boys, but I felt like it would be an interesting contrast to compare the two. As always, I'll be taking breaks between sections of this document to do other videos that strike my interest, but we'll slowly work our way through it. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.